suggested by Matthew and John. The appearance narrative spans such a breadth of independent sources in the Gospels that it cannot reasonably be denied that the earliest disciples did have such experiences. Even the skeptical German New Testament critic Gerd Lüdemann therefore concludes it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Finally, fact number 4. The original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation that the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead, and Jewish messianic expectations had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed as a criminal. 2, according to Old Testament law, Jesus' execution exposed him as a heretic, a man literally accursed by God. 3, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar at Emory University, states, some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. In summary, then, there are 4 facts which are agreed upon by the majority of scholars who have written on these subjects. Jesus' burial in the tomb, his tombs being found empty, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief. There's no plausible naturalistic explanation of these 4 facts. And therefore, it seems to me that we are justified in believing that Jesus rose bodily from the dead and thus was who he claimed to be. But that brings us then to our second main contention that I wanted to talk about tonight. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, Christianity is a delusion which no rational adult should believe. Now, this seems to me to be just common sense. And yet, remarkably, Marcus thinks that Christianity can and should go on quite nicely without the literal resurrection. He disagrees, in effect, with the Apostle Paul, who said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless and you are still in your sins. But Dr. Borg makes a sharp distinction between the pre-Easter Jesus and the post-Easter Jesus. The pre-Easter Jesus, he says in his writings, was merely a human being who is now dead and gone. The post-Easter Jesus, he says, is what Jesus became after his death. The post-Easter Jesus lives on in the experience and tradition of the church. But we've got to be very careful here. What Jesus literally became after his death, on Dr. Borg's view, was a rotting mass of flesh. What Dr. Borg means by the post-Easter Jesus is what Jesus became in the thinking and imagination of the Christian church. It's crucial to understand that on Dr. Borg's view, there really isn't anybody out there called the post-Easter Jesus who exists objectively, independently of our experience and imagination. The best analogy for this that I can think of is the relationship between Santa Claus and the original 4th century bishop, St. Nicholas. Nicholas was the real person who lived and died. Santa Claus is an imaginary figure who, though very real in the experience of small children, does not actually exist. Now, while rational adults might believe in some of the things that this imaginary figure symbolizes, like, say, the spirit of giving, we wouldn't believe in him. Now, in the same way, if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, we might believe in what the post-Easter Jesus symbolizes, say, love for others, but we wouldn't believe in him. We wouldn't worship him or pray to him or think that he loves us, because that would be letting ourselves be deluded by our own imaginations. Now, despite his very misleading Christian language, I think that on Dr. Borg's view, the post-Easter Jesus is just a symbolic figure. When Dr. Borg affirms Jesus is Lord, or Jesus lives, or God has vindicated Jesus, he doesn't regard these statements as literally true. Rather, these statements are metaphorical. And Dr. Borg says, I affirm these metaphors to be true. But now we come to real problems. Now think with me now, stick with me here. What is required for a metaphor to be true? If I come in out of the rain and say, it's raining cats and dogs out there, what does it mean to say that this metaphor is true? Well, it means that there is a literal truth which this metaphor figuratively expresses, namely that it's raining hard outside. Without such a literal truth at its core, a metaphor is just a meaningless combination of words. If I come in and say, it's raining zebras and armadillos outside, then unless I can state some literal truth which these words figuratively express, then they're not a metaphor at all, but just nonsense. Thus, metaphorical truth presupposes literal truth. No literal truth, then no metaphorical truth either. So, the crucial question is, what literal truth is expressed by statements about the post-Easter Jesus, like Jesus is risen, or Jesus loves me, or Jesus lives? Well, here Dr. Borg faces what I think is an insuperable problem. For he says that there are no literal truths about God. He thinks God is ineffable, meaning beyond all rational thought. He writes, God is ineffable. God is beyond all images, physical and mental. All our thinking about God are attempts to express the ineffable. The ineffable is beyond all our concepts, even this one. But that entails that there is no literal truth expressed by his affirmations about the post-Easter Jesus. Therefore, they're not metaphors, they're nonsense. But it gets even worse, for it's incoherent to say that God is beyond all our concepts. For if none of our concepts applies to God, then even the concept of ineffability does not apply to God. But if the concept of ineffability does not apply to God, then God is not ineffable after all. And thus Dr. Borg's view is self-refuting. If it's true, then it's false. And Dr. Borg seems to realize this when he says God is beyond all our concepts, even this one. But if the concept of ineffability does not apply to God, then it's not the case that God is ineffable, as Dr. Borg affirms. And thus it seems to me that this position is hopelessly incoherent. It is self-refuting and cannot be rationally affirmed. Fortunately, however, there's no need to engage in such theological salvage operations. The historical facts undergirding the bodily resurrection of Jesus are well established and generally agreed upon. The post-Easter Jesus is the pre-Easter Jesus, risen from the dead and gloriously alive today.